Bob Jensen is responsible for providing oversight to the team in the US Department of Homeland Security that keeps Americans informed about what the US government is doing to help them prepare for, survive from and/or recover from major disasters. Bob has played a key role in more than 30 of them, including the Deepwater Horizon oil spill response in the country's deep south to the more recent Hurricane Sandy on the east coast. Bob was also deployed to set up and lead the US Government Joint Information Centre after a massive earthquake hit Haiti in January 2010. He's also been the US military's choice to manage the information flow about America's activities from war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan into living rooms back home and to local and regional audiences. More recently, he spent time working in the White House as part of the team that developed communication strategies and key talking points about national security issues for President Barack Obama and his senior staff. Today, he's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs at the US Department of Homeland Security. He's taken leave from that position to come to Australia on a Fulbright Senior Specialist grant, visiting 8 cities, conducting nearly 50 presentations, including a keynote speaking engagement at the 2013 Emergency Media and Public Affairs Conference held in Brisbane. The trip down under for Bob also included a meeting at the ACT Emergency Services Agency, where he spent time discussing the important role of communications with senior officers and public information staff. While in Canberra, Bob also agreed to talk with the DC Radio Show. Bob Jensen, welcome to the DC Radio Show.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
I suppose the first thing public affairs professionals, emergency media people in particular would like to know is, what would you consider the top, I suppose, 3 key things for people that are practitioners of public information during emergencies?
Okay, number one is they need to have the relationships with their stakeholders before the emergency happens. That's something that it's hard to create those relationships when the disaster is ongoing or just happened. Number 2, they have to already understand who the stakeholders are and understand how they get their information. They may not get the information from the main media. So for example, if you have someone who doesn't speak English, maybe they speak Spanish, maybe they speak another language, you have to know where they get their information from. Maybe there's multilingual media that's out there, maybe they get it through their church, and you have to figure out those channels to get to them. And then third, you have to understand what are the key messages that you're putting out there, and wherever you are in the hierarchy, you need to make sure that you're consistent and that you're not putting information out there that is inconsistent with everything else that's going on.
One of the big challenges in the field that you work in is timeliness yet accuracy. Mm-hmm. Which one gets priority?
Neither. I'm going to tell you what, there's always this this competition about, do we put information out when we're not completely sure? The point is we should always put information out that we have at the time if it is life-saving or life-sustaining. We also have holding statements. So for example, if something happens, a bombing happens, we're going to put something out right away, even though we don't know a lot. But we need to put something out that says 3 things from the federal government. Number 1, we know about it. Number 2, we are working very closely with all of our other federal agencies and with local authorities to investigate and find out what's going on. And then the third thing is we're going to put out more information as soon as we have it. And that way we kind of maintain public trust, because if we don't know what's going on, the public's going to not be very confident in our ability to resolve the issue.
Now, you have been involved in a number of big incidents in your career and in recent years. Most recently, the Boston bombings, Sandy in New York, the oil spill, and Hurricane Katrina. Yep. What influences social media played in that as opposed to the traditional forms of media?
Well, let me first make sure you understand that the Boston bombing was run by the FBI, and we in Homeland Security only supported them. So they really ran that. I did not have a really lead role in that. But I did lead the federal response in communication in Sandy, in New York, and New Jersey. And of course, we also did things down in the Gulf with Deepwater Horizon. We're seeing a growing influence of social media as a source of information, but let's also understand what's happening on the ground as well. There's no power. Your house is destroyed. You're not going to be able to watch TV. Many people in America no longer even have radios. So what you're going to use is you're going to use your smartphone. And guess what you're going to get on there? You're going to get your Twitter feeds, you're going to get access to your email. So we're finding that becomes more and more of a source of information for people when they are in a disaster situation. So we have to be a part of that. We have to figure out how to do that better. Part of why I'm here in Australia is to share information, but to get information back. And I'm finding that here it's exactly the same as in the United States as it is in Europe and other areas, that we're all of us in the communication business for government are facing the same challenges with social media. How do you do it right? You know, what are the best practices in that? And hopefully we're going to share all of those.
I suppose traditional media, newspapers, TV, radio, as you said, is that really, I suppose, old hat these days, or do you still need to use those?
No, you still need to use them. I mean, it's not either or. And in fact, now you have to use every channel of communication. And the media is just one channel. Social media is just another channel. We use town halls. We use being in direct contact with people to get information out. We try and give information to community leaders so that they can talk to their community because they're trusted figures. So you can't just use one channel to get that information out. You've got to use all the channels.
How important is one-on-one communication now in disasters? So the old days of just send out a press release, I mean, I think that's pretty well past it for most places. They realise that, but what about taking to that next level like you did in Sandy where people actually knocked on homeowners' doors?
Well, you can't put a price on that. It is so important. First off, presence is communication, right? So it's very important for us to be seen, to be there, right? Because if you look around and you don't see anyone there who is part of the response, then the feeling of the public is that no one is caring about what's happening to me. So presence is communication in and of itself. And then, of course, you need to find out what exactly those individuals need, which is why we have our community relations function to do that, going door to door, to find out what the needs on the ground are, because you can take aerial photos and you can see, yes, there's a bunch of houses that are destroyed, but you don't really know what the situation is. You don't know what those people need, and that's part of the function that they have.
While you're here in Australia, have you picked up any ideas that you've gone, we didn't think of that?
Oh, I've picked up a lot of different ideas. Well, it was, as I found in Victoria, what's interesting is they're using a social media decision matrix that the U.S. Air Force created, and I didn't even know about that, so I learned about that. Some of the great ideas, for example, there's an idea that you have an emergency services memorial. I think that's fantastic. I don't know that I'm going to be able to get that done in America, but I certainly am going to pose the idea that we have a memorial to folks who worked in emergency services, emergency management. I can go on and on. Every single place that I've gone to, I'm getting great new ideas.
How valuable is it for you in your position to, I suppose, interact with colleagues in places like Australia, and is that something that you think we could strengthen over time?
Well, we absolutely should be doing it. That's part of the reason why I came here was no one has a monopoly on good ideas. And it's this exchange of ideas and dialogue that is really very helpful, because as I found, all of our countries are facing exactly the same challenges, right? Whether it's in communication or whether it's in the operational side. So we do have a memorandum of cooperation between the U.S. and Australia, signed by your Attorney General and by my boss, the Secretary of Homeland Security. And in that memorandum of cooperation, communication is just one of the areas, but there's also sharing of information on how we do the operational side as well. And you can't put a price on that. It's very, very important, and I think we want to continue to do those kinds of exchanges of ideas.
How important does governments in America, from the White House to state to local, recognise the function of communications in a disaster or emergency? Is it at the level where it should be, or is it an afterthought, oh yeah, we better get some information out after we've responded with the fire trucks or EMTs or whatever the case may be?
Well, my sense, especially at the federal level, is that we totally understand that that is one of the critical roles that a leadership role has. I mean, you're going to need to get out there and tell the public that we understand what's going on, maintain their public trust and confidence by explaining what we're doing, and not just using spin doctor type messaging, but actually getting out there and saying, here's X, Y, and Z, what we're doing. Absolutely critical. And I think that we understand that and do that quite well. I know that President Obama, days before Sandy hit, was already out there, and we were showing that he was getting briefed up. And he let the American public know that the federal government was going to do everything it could to support the states that are going to be impacted by Sandy. Sandy is the second largest natural disaster hit America. The governors understood this. The governors were out. The mayors of key cities were out. So I think at all levels they understand that information is one of the most important things that you can provide to the public, because they all want to know what's going to happen. They want to know what to do. So.
Traditionally in bureaucracy, organisations tend to be their own silos, and this is my job, that's yours, and never the twain shall meet. But it was proven in Sandy, for instance, where Governor Christie and President Obama stood together and communicated to the public, yet only days or weeks before. Governor Christie was heavily criticising President Obama as part of the US presidential election campaign. How important is that these days? Like, I suppose the public's BS meter is really attuned, and they don't care about all that internal politics.
Well, I'm going to tell you what, I'm not going to really comment on the discussions that are happening about around the election, but I will say this, that right at the time of the disaster of Sandy hitting, all of the leaders there understood that it's not about politics. It's not about Republican or Democrat. It's about helping the people who are impacted, the disaster survivors. And I think we saw proof there on the ground through what the leaders were saying of either side, that they came together and it was about the American people. It wasn't about politics. And I think that is very, very important.
We've talked about governments at different levels. What about private enterprise? What role should they be playing in emergency preparedness as well as response and recovery?
Well, we have really done a much better job of integrating the private sector into our efforts, because you cannot have disaster recovery without the private sector. The private sector is key to that. If you can't open up the stores and you can't open up businesses again, people don't have jobs to go to. They can't get back to some sense of normalcy. That's something we really found, that we need to make sure that the private sector understands what we're doing, that we share information with them. They share information with us about which stores are open, which stores won't. Helps us better decide where our commodities are going to go. We also have a better sense of what kind of needs are not going to be met, because if there's no grocery stores open, people are going to need to have food. I think I can't say enough about how much our relationship with many of the big box stores in America has been very, very helpful to us in getting the message out about preparedness.
And that's also about public confidence, isn't it? That
sure.
The quicker things turn to what I suppose is close to normality is what, considering whatever the situation is, then the more people are going to be inclined to recover in a more positive light than if things like stores aren't open for longer periods of time.
Absolutely. I mean, there definitely is a disaster psychology, and you have to give people the not just the image, but the reality that things are getting back to where they can actually get things on their own and bring their life back into some kind of a semblance of what it was before. It's always going to be hard, but I think that the private sector plays that huge role in making sure that people can get what they need to go on with their daily lives.
We're talking with Bob Jensen, who is a very well-travelled public affairs practitioner for various US government agencies. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to ask him about his time helping the military out overseas, and also what it's like working in the White House. This is the DC Radio Show with Darren Cutrupi. My special guest is Bob Jensen. Bob, first of all, you have served overseas with the military in a public affairs capacity. Is that any different from managing a thing like Sandy or the Gulf oil spill?
It's very different. I mean, well, there's a lot of things that are the same,
Yep.
because your communication principles are no different in a disaster situation than it is in a combat zone situation. But obviously it's different in that people are trying to kill you. At Baghdad, during the time that I was there, we had attacks every single day. It was a very dangerous time. Things have changed. And I was deployed there as a civilian, I was not active duty military. But I will say that the opportunity to really learn your craft when you're in a situation like that is incredible. So my role when I was sent over, the second year I went over there, I was running all the national media engagement for the military out of Iraq, and ramping that up so that we could actually tell our story, being a lot more proactive than reactive, and making sure that we were kind of driving the media rather than just following what they were saying and being reactive. So it was a huge lesson learned. I had to do a lot of media training for some of the military leadership who had not done much media. And we ramped up from 3 to 5 national media engagements a week to 50 to 70. So it was quite a bit of work. But I've got to say, I have a deep respect for the military and for all that they do. So it was really a fantastic time for me to be a small part of that.
There has been criticism about that was sort of, I suppose, the US government's way to try and make positive what was a very negative story domestically back home, with so many troops being killed in the conflict, which obviously that's what happens in war.
Well, I'm not going to say we were trying to make it positive from a negative, because when things were bad, we were very honest about that. What we were trying to do is get a balanced story, because there was not a balanced story. We were absolutely not being portrayed in a full aspects of what we were doing. So it wasn't, there was not a metric that said, oh, you've got to get X number of good news stories. That wasn't exactly what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do was turn the dialogue around so that you could see the whole picture. And part of the problem was that 85% of the violence happening in Baghdad was happening within a 30-mile radius of the center of Baghdad, right? 85% of the violence in Iraq. And so that's where all the media was centered, right? So that's all you saw all day long, was everything exploding, really bad things. Whereas the vast majority of Iraq, it wasn't quite like that. So I took a lot of the media outside of Baghdad to say, well, there's a whole country here. Is it bad? Yes, absolutely is. But there's also some progress. And eventually, little by little, as we were turning over each of the provinces to Iraqi control, we wanted to tell that story and show the progress. So it's not just about battles and people dying. It's about what kind of progress is happening so that the Iraqi government could stand up on its own. And of course, they're doing that now. It's been several years since we pulled out, and there's still some challenges and issues. But I think the violence is way down from what it was at the peak, which unfortunately was the time when I was there. So again, it wasn't about, again, there was no metric to try and just get good news stories. It's about getting balanced coverage.
And part of media organisations and journalists telling an accurate story is giving them access to actually know what's going on, isn't it? So
no, it absolutely. And so my mandate when I was sent over there was to give them that access. Prior to that, again, they were very reactive, and you did not have a lot of the leaders that were out there talking to the media and telling and explaining to the American public and to the international audiences what exactly we were doing, where we were making progress, where we were having challenges. So we were very honest about the challenges that we faced. But if you don't have anyone from the military talking about it, all you're going to get is what the media is covering and from their perspective, right? And so I had to do my very best to give them access to tell that fuller, balanced story.
Now, you spent some time in the White House. How high on the radar is emergency preparedness and response from President Obama?
Okay, it's very high on his radar. I got to say that he campaigned on doing a better job in relationship to any kind of disaster response and recovery. And if you look at what was done during Sandy, the preparedness briefings, he was briefed up every single day by Craig Fugate, the administrator of FEMA, by his Homeland Security team. He went to FEMA, and the entire response team was there to tell him what was going on. He had contact with the governors and with key mayors. He was very focused on what we were doing and gave very clear guidance to make sure that we provided everything we could to support the states and the impacted citizens.
Is America more prepared or better prepared now for emergencies than they were back when Katrina happened, because that obviously seemed to be a turning point in the public point of view, where FEMA, for instance, was heavily criticised, for lack of good response.
Right. Well, I got to say, part of it is FEMA itself has grown and has been given new regulatory authorities. For example, at the time of Katrina, FEMA did not have a lot of legal authorities to spend the kind of funds that they can do now pre a storm even hitting. So that kind of opened up a lot more opportunity to do a better job. Frankly, I think we are a lot more prepared. There's been billions of dollars spent on grants to help cities and states prepare and create a better capability. And as we're going to be putting out probably in about a week or so, the National Preparedness Report. We're doing an annual report that kind of looks at and gives a judgment on how prepared the nation is as a whole, and what areas we're doing really well, and what areas we need to do a little bit more work on. And I think that's something that's very high on this president's agenda, is to make sure that we are doing all of this in a smart and systematic way.
And I suppose you can't fix a problem or improve something unless you know it needs improving in the first place. So that plan obviously provides that.
Oh, absolutely. It's a thing called Presidential Policy 8. It's a directive that talks about how do we do a better job overall of preparing the nation to become more resilient.
Now, I know in your time working to the White House, you have been in the Oval Office. Does it really look like it does on the movies?
Well, probably better. I mean, it is a very well-known office in America. You see it on TV all the time. It's really interesting to go in there and you see the president has pictures of his family behind his desk. It's an incredibly awesome experience to be in there, and I've had the honor of being in there quite a few times. Of course, I'm the guy against the wall. I'm being a press guy. I'm not one sitting there briefing the president. That's not what I did.
So you stay out of the shots, but you're there in the background.
Absolutely.
Hope you've enjoyed your trip to Australia and continue to do so, and thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. My pleasure, and I'm having a great time here. I do want to put a shout out to EMPA, Emergency Media and Public Affairs, the University of South Queensland, and Australian National University, who are my hosts here on this Fulbright that I'm on. So I got to give them that shout out. So.
And they've looked out after you well, I believe.
Oh, fantastic.
What's better, American coffee or Australian?
Well, you're going to make me say that, right?
You don't have to.
Australian beer.